The desert remembers everything. That's what Audrey Ramirez's grandmother used to say, back when Audrey was small enough to fit in the crook of her arm, back when the Arizona sky seemed infinite and forgiving. The desert remembers the footprints that fade in the wind, the blood that seeps into sand, the secrets buried beneath saguaro shadows. It remembers every lie, every truth, every moment when the world shifts and nothing is ever the same again. Audrey didn't believe her grandmother then. She was 7 years old, gap-toothed and fearless, running through the scrubland behind their house in Maricopa with her arms spread wide like she could catch the horizon. But now, standing in the parking lot of the Sun Valley Sheriff's Department on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, with the Arizona sun beating down on her shoulders and her phone vibrating against her palm, Audrey understood exactly what her grandmother meant. The desert had remembered, and now so would everyone else. The text message was from her brother, Marcus. Turn on the news. Now, Audrey's fingers trembled as she opened the browser on her phone. The headline loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, each word appearing like a verdict. Arrest made in 2000 cold case murder of Elena Torres. Suspect identified AS local business owner. The world tilted. Audrey reached out, her hand finding the sun-heated metal of a pickup truck, grounding herself against the wave of vertigo that threatened to pull her under. Elena Torres. The name was a ghost, a whisper, a wound that had never healed in the 24 years since that summer night when everything changed. Audrey had been 11 years old when Elena disappeared. She had been 11 years old when her entire world learned what it meant to lose someone, to search, to hope, to grieve without a body, without answers, without closure. Elena Torres had been 17, beautiful, brilliant, beloved. She'd been the girl who tutored Audrey in math after school, who wore jasmine perfume and silver hoop earrings, who dreamed of becoming a doctor and returning to Maricopa to give back to the community that raised her. She'd been the girl who vanished on July 23, 2000, after leaving her shift at the Desert Rose Diner. Her car found abandoned on Highway 347 with the driver's side door open and her shoes still inside. No blood, no struggle, no Elena, just absence, echoing across 2 decades. Audrey's vision blurred. She blinked hard, forcing herself to focus on the screen. The article loaded more details. DNA evidence recently analyzed through advanced forensic technology. Breakthrough in cold case unit. Arrest made early this morning. Press conference scheduled for 2 p.m. But it was the name at the bottom of the article that made Audrey's stomach drop, that made the desert heat suddenly feel like ice in her veins. Thomas Garrett, 58, owner of Garrett's Hardware and longtime Maricopa resident. No, that couldn't be right. Thomas Garrett. Tom Garrett. The man who sponsored the Little League team every summer. The man who donated tools for the high school's vocational program. The man who had organized search parties in those terrible weeks after Elena vanished. Who had stood on his truck bed with a megaphone, coordinating volunteers, promising Elena's mother that they would bring her daughter home. The man whose hardware store Audrey had walked into 1,000 times, who always remembered her name, who had given her her first job at 16, teaching her how to mix paint and cut keys and treat customers with respect and kindness. That Tom Garrett? Audrey's phone rang. Marcus. She answered without thinking. Are you seeing this? Her brother's voice was hoarse, disbelieving. Audrey, are you? I'm seeing it. Her own voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. It doesn't make sense. Tom Garrett? He helped search for her. He was at every vigil. Marcus broke off, and Audrey could hear his breathing, ragged and uneven. Mom's losing it. She's convinced it's a mistake. Dad's not saying anything, just sitting at the kitchen table staring at the wall. Audrey closed her eyes. Her parents. God, her parents. Her father had been a sheriff's deputy in 2000, one of the first responders when Elena's car was found. Her mother had been Elena's mentor through the community college pipeline program, had written her recommendation letters, had believed in her future with the fierce certainty of someone who saw herself in a young woman's dreams. I'm coming over, Audrey said. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The whole town's going to implode, Marcus whispered. You know that, right? This is going to destroy everything. Audrey knew. She knew because Maricopa was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where your history was written in the faces you passed at the grocery store, where trust was the currency that kept everything functioning. And Tom Garrett had been wealthy in that trust, had spent decades building it, investing it, until he was woven into the fabric of the community so tightly that removing him would leave a hole the size of the desert itself. She ended the call and stood in the parking lot for a long moment, watching the heat waves shimmer above the asphalt. Inside the sheriff's department, she knew there would be chaos. Detectives scrambling to prepare for the press conference, phone lines lighting up with media requests, officers fielding calls from frightened residents who suddenly had to reconsider everything they thought they knew about their neighbor. Their friend, the man who sold them hammers and welcomed their children into his store with lollipops and patience. Audrey's own memories of Tom Garrett flickered through her mind like a slideshow. His laugh warm and genuine. His hands, always stained with wood oil and calloused from honest work. The way he'd taught her to splice electrical wire when she was 17, his voice patient, his encouragement sincere. You've got steady hands, Audrey, he'd told her. And a good head on your shoulders. You're going to do something important with your life. She had believed him. She had trusted him. Everyone had. Audrey's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from her best friend, Serena Vega, who still lived in the house next door to the one where Elena Torres had grown up. Serena, who had been Elena's little sister's best friend, who had spent her entire childhood in the shadow of that disappearance, who had dedicated her life to victim advocacy because of what happened in 2000. Tell me this is a nightmare, Serena said the moment Audrey answered. Her voice was thick with tears. I wish I could. My mom's at Mrs. Torres's house right now. Audrey, Elena's mom. She collapsed. They had to call an ambulance. 24 years of not knowing, and now this. Now it's Tom fucking Garrett, and I can't process this. I can't make it make sense. Audrey could hear voices in the background, the sound of sirens. The whole neighborhood would be gathering, drawn together by shock and grief and the terrible need to understand. What if we were wrong about everything? Serena continued, her words tumbling out faster now. What if every vigil, every prayer circle, every fundraiser we did for the Elena Torres Memorial Scholarship? What if he was there, pretending, lying, while he knew exactly what happened to her? What if he looked Mrs. Torres in the eye and lied to her face while she begged for information about her daughter? We don't know the full story yet, Audrey said, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. The DNA doesn't lie, Audrey. The science doesn't lie. People lie. Tom Garrett lied. The line went quiet except for Serena's breathing. Then, are you going to the press conference? Yes. I'll meet you there. Audrey drove through Maricopa in a daze. Her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. The town looked the same as it always did. Small houses with desert landscaping, the water tower with its fading paint, the elementary school where she'd learned to read, the stretch of Main Street with its handful of local businesses. But everything felt different now, like she was seeing it all through warped glass. Every familiar landmark suddenly suspect, every memory tainted. She passed Garrett's hardware. The lights were off. The open sign turned to closed. Someone had already spray-painted something on the front window, but Audrey didn't slow down to read it. She didn't want to know. Not yet. At her parents' house, she found exactly what Marcus had described. Her mother pacing the kitchen, her face red and puffy from crying, her hands twisting a dish towel into knots. Her father sitting at the table, still in his fishing vest from his early morning trip to the reservoir, staring at nothing. Audrey. Her mother crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into a fierce hug. Oh, baby, this can't be real. It can't be. Mom. I worked with him on the town council for 15 years. 15 years, Audrey. We sat next to each other at budget meetings. We carpooled to the state conference in Phoenix. I went to his daughter's wedding. Her mother pulled back, her eyes searching Audrey's face as if looking for answers her daughter couldn't possibly have. How could I not see it? How could none of us see it? Audrey's father finally spoke, his voice quiet and heavy. Because he didn't want us to see it. Because men like that are good at hiding. Because we believed what we wanted to believe. The words settled over the kitchen like dust. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his own eyes red. They're saying he kept souvenirs. That's how they connected the DNA. Someone cleaning out a storage unit that used to belong to his mother-in-law found a box of items. Called it into the cold case tip line 6 months ago. It took this long to process everything, to build the case. Souvenirs. The word made Audrey's skin crawl. What kind of souvenirs? Elena's jasmine perfume? Her silver hoop earrings? The textbooks she'd been carrying that night? Audrey's mind recoiled from the possibilities, from the images that threatened to form. I need to get to the sheriff's department, Audrey said. The press conference. Her mother nodded. We'll watch from here. I can't face all those people yet. Not until I understand. But as Audrey drove back through town, she wondered if anyone would ever truly understand. How did you comprehend 24 years of deception? How did you reconcile the man who helped you learn a trade with the man who allegedly murdered a teenage girl and let her family suffer in agonizing limbo for decades? The parking lot at the sheriff's department was already packed by the time Audrey arrived at 1:30 p.m. News vans from Phoenix stations crowded the street, their satellite dishes raised toward the relentless sky. Reporters checked their equipment. Producers barked instructions. Photographers jockeyed for position. And everywhere, residents of Maricopa gathered in tight clusters, their faces showing the same stunned disbelief that Audrey felt in her bones. She found Serena near the front entrance, standing with a group of women Audrey recognized, all connected to Elena in some way. There was Mrs. Chun, who had been Elena's chemistry teacher. Maria Sandoval, who had worked with Elena at the diner. Jennifer Hayes, the guidance counselor who had helped Elena apply to pre-med programs. Women who had spent 24 years wondering, searching, hoping, grieving. Women who now had to confront an answer they never could have imagined. They brought him through here 2 hours ago, Mrs. Chun said, her voice brittle. In handcuffs. Tom Garrett in handcuffs. I saw it with my own eyes, and I still don't believe it. His wife left town this morning, Maria added, packed up her car and drove to her sister's in Tucson. Can you imagine? Married to him for 36 years, and now this. Audrey thought about Mrs. Garrett. Susan, who volunteered at the library, who made the best tres leches cake for every community potluck, who had always seemed so content, so peacefully settled into her life. What did she know? When did she know it? Or had she been as deceived as everyone else? Her entire life a lie she was just now being forced to see. The questions spiraled endlessly, each one opening into a dozen more. At exactly 2 p.m., Sheriff Rodriguez emerged from the building and approached the podium that had been set up on the front steps. He was flanked by detectives, by the county prosecutor, by victim advocates. His face was grave, his posture rigid with the weight of what he was about to say. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Good afternoon, Sheriff Rodriguez began. I'm here to provide information about a significant development in the Elena Torres case. As many of you know, Elena Torres disappeared on July 23, 2000, and despite extensive investigation, her case remained unsolved for 24 years. Today, I can confirm that we have arrested Thomas William Garrett, age 58, on charges of first-degree murder in connection with Elena's death. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Audrey felt Serena's hand find hers, squeezing tight. The breakthrough in this case came from advances in forensic DNA analysis and evidence that was recently recovered and submitted to our cold case unit. I cannot discuss specific details of the evidence at this time, as this is an ongoing investigation and we must preserve the integrity of the prosecution's case. What I can tell you is that the evidence is substantial, credible, and compelling. Sheriff Rodriguez paused, and Audrey saw something in his face that looked like grief. He had been a young deputy in 2000. He had searched for Elena, too. I know this news is shocking and painful for our community, he continued. Thomas Garrett has been a prominent figure in Maricopa for decades. Many of you know him personally. Many of you trusted him. I understand that this arrest raises difficult questions and challenges our sense of safety and certainty. I want to assure you that justice, though delayed, is finally being served. Audrey couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her childhood bedroom. She'd stayed at her parents' house, unable to face her empty apartment, and stared at the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling that had been there since she was 12. Outside, she could hear the desert settling into its nighttime rhythms. The distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of wind through creosote bushes, the occasional rumble of a truck on the highway. Sounds that had comforted her all her life. Sounds that now felt ominous, like the desert was speaking in a language she could no longer understand. She kept replaying the press conference. Sheriff Rodriguez's careful words. The questions shouted by reporters. The way the prosecutor had stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. And somewhere, in a holding cell downtown, Tom Garrett sat alone with his secrets finally exposed. What was he thinking right now? Did he feel relief that the charade was over? Regret? Fear? Or was he still constructing lies? Still believing he could talk his way out of this the way he'd apparently talked his way through 24 years of freedom? Audrey's phone glowed on her nightstand. She turned off the ringer after the 50th call, but she could see the notifications still streaming in. Text messages from old friends, from former coworkers, from people she hadn't spoken to in years, all of them reaching out because they knew. Everyone in Maricopa knew that Audrey had worked for Tom Garrett, that she'd been his employee, his protégé, the girl he'd mentored and encouraged and shaped. What did that make her? What did it mean that she'd taken his advice, followed his guidance, built parts of her identity on lessons he'd taught her? One message stood out. It was from her college advisor, Dr. Patricia Whitmore, the woman who had helped Audrey navigate her degree in criminal justice, who had written her recommendations for graduate school, who had believed in her even when Audrey doubted herself. Audrey, I saw the news. I know this must be devastating. Please remember, you are not defined by his actions. You are not complicit in his sins. The person you've become is a testament to your own character, not his. Call me if you need to talk. Anytime. Audrey felt tears sting her eyes. She blinked them back, but they came anyway, sliding hot down her temples into her hair. She wasn't crying for Tom Garrett. She was crying for Elena, for the life stolen from her, for the decades her family had spent in tortured limbo. She was crying for Mrs. Torres, who had collapsed under the weight of finally knowing. She was crying for the community, for the fracture that now ran through the heart of Maricopa like a fault line. And maybe, in some small, ashamed part of herself, she was crying for the loss of her own innocence, for the death of the simple belief that good people were good and bad people showed themselves clearly, that the world made sense and justice was straightforward. Tom Garrett had taught her that good work mattered, that treating people with respect mattered, that showing up every day and doing your best was how you built a life worth living. Those lessons hadn't changed. The principles were still true, but they were now forever tangled with the knowledge that the man who taught them had murdered a teenage girl and hidden it behind a smile and a firm handshake and a reputation for generosity. How did you hold both truths at once? Audrey finally gave up on sleep around 4 a.m. She got up, pulled on jeans and a faded Arizona State sweatshirt, and went to the kitchen. Her mother was already there, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at an old photo album spread open in front of her. Couldn't sleep either? Audrey asked softly. Her mother looked up, and Audrey was startled by how old she looked in the pre-dawn light. When had those lines deepened around her eyes? When had her hair gotten so much gray? I keep thinking about all the times I saw him, her mother said. All the conversations. The town council meetings where we debated park funding and street repairs. The community potlucks where he brought that potato salad Susan made. The 4th of July parade where he dressed up as Uncle Sam and threw candy to the kids. She touched the photo album gently. I'm looking at pictures from Elena's memorial service. The one we held 6 months after she disappeared, when we still hoped but were starting to accept. Audrey moved closer and looked at the photos. There was young Elena, frozen at 17, her smile bright and full of future. There were her parents, hollowed out by grief but still standing. There was the crowd of mourners, The entire town turned out to honor a girl they'd lost. And there, in the back row, standing with his head bowed respectfully, was Tom Garrett. He was there, her mother whispered. He stood in that church and listened to her mother talk about her beautiful daughter. And he knew. He knew what he'd done. And he was there, pretending to grieve with us. Audrey felt sick. Her mother closed the album with shaking hands. I'm sorry, baby. You don't need to see this. You don't need to carry this weight. We all carry it now, Audrey said. The whole town does. They sat in silence as the sky outside began to lighten, the darkness giving way to the soft gray of early morning. Audrey made fresh coffee. Her mother eventually got up and started making breakfast, eggs, toast, the mechanical rituals of normalcy when nothing felt normal at all. Marcus appeared around 6, already dressed for his job at the county assessor's office. He looked like he'd slept as poorly as Audrey had. Their father emerged shortly after, and the four of them sat around the table, picking at food none of them wanted, listening to the local radio station as it discussed nothing but the arrest. The DJ's voice was somber. We're opening the phone lines this morning for anyone who wants to share their thoughts and feelings about yesterday's shocking arrest. This is a time for our community to come together, to support each other, to process what we're all experiencing. The first caller was Mrs. Chun, Elena's former teacher. I just want to say, I don't know what to say. I taught that man's children. I saw him at parent-teacher conferences. He was always so engaged, so supportive. How do you reconcile that? How do you... Her voice broke. The next caller was angrier. You know what makes me sick? He organized search parties. He was out there with the rest of us, looking for her, when he knew damn well we wouldn't find her. That's evil. That's a level of cruelty I can't even comprehend. More callers followed, each one expressing some variation of the same stunned horror, the same sense of betrayal, the same desperate need to understand the incomprehensible. Audrey's father finally turned off the radio. This is going to get worse before it gets better, he said quietly. People need someone to blame. They need to feel like they can control something. It's going to get messy. He was right. By mid-morning, when Audrey finally drove to her apartment to shower and change clothes, she saw evidence of the community's rage everywhere. Someone had smashed the windows of Garrett's hardware. Graffiti covered the walls. Murderer. Monster. Rot in hell. A small crowd had gathered outside, not doing anything in particular, just standing there as if bearing witness, as if their presence could somehow retroactively change what had happened. Audrey drove past without stopping. She couldn't look at that building, couldn't reconcile the place where she'd learned so much with what she now knew had been built on a foundation of lies and violence. Her apartment felt strange when she walked in. Too quiet, too still, like it belonged to someone else's life. She stood in the shower for a long time, letting the hot water run over her until it started to cool, trying to wash away the contaminated feeling that clung to her skin. But it didn't help. The stain was deeper than water could reach. Her phone rang while she was getting dressed. Serena, the prosecutor's office just released more information, Serena said without preamble. Are you sitting down? Just tell me. They found Elena's remains, last month, buried on a property that used to belong to Garrett's family, out past the county line. That's what the DNA matched, bone samples they were able to extract and process. Audrey, she was there the whole time. All those years we searched, all those theories about human trafficking or her running away or... She was buried in the desert 30 miles from her home. Audrey sat down heavily on her bed. Elena's remains. A real physical confirmation. Not just DNA evidence or circumstantial connections, but Elena herself, her bones, her body, finally found after 24 years of absence. Mrs. Torres wants to have a proper funeral, Serena continued. Once the coroner releases, once they're done with the evidence processing, she wants to finally lay her daughter to rest. And she wants the whole community there. She says she wants everyone to see what was taken from her, to witness what Tom Garrett stole. Of course I'll be there, Audrey said. There's something else. Serena's voice dropped lower. The detectives are interviewing everyone who worked for him or knew him well. They want to build a comprehensive picture of his behavior over the years. They've already talked to his wife, his kids, his business partners. Audrey, they're going to want to talk to you. Audrey had known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed still made her stomach clench. When? Soon. Maybe today. They're being thorough. They don't want any stone unturned, any detail missed. This needs to be an airtight case. After Serena hung up, Audrey sat on her bed for a long time, trying to prepare herself for questions she didn't know how to answer. What could she tell them? That Tom Garrett had been a good boss? That he'd treated her fairly, paid her well, taught her skills that served her throughout her life? That he'd never once made her uncomfortable, never once showed a hint of the monster he apparently was? Or was she missing something? Had there been signs, subtle indicators she'd been too young or too trusting to recognize? She ransacked her memories, searching for red flags, for moments that might have revealed his true nature if she'd only known how to look. She remembered being 17, working the register one slow Tuesday afternoon. A woman had come in, asking about replacing the locks on her doors. She'd had a black eye, poorly concealed with makeup. Tom had spent an hour with her, patient and kind, not just selling her new locks but also giving her the business cards of local domestic violence resources, speaking to her with such gentleness that the woman had cried. Audrey had thought then that Tom was a good man, a man who cared, a man who saw people in pain and tried to help. What did that memory mean now? Was it real compassion, or was it performance? Could a man who murdered Elena Torres truly care about a stranger's safety, or was everything he did merely calculation, image management, the careful construction of a mask he wore so long it became indistinguishable from his face? The detective who called that afternoon introduced herself as Detective Sarah Morales. Her voice was professional but not unkind. Ms. Ramirez, I know this is a difficult time, but we'd appreciate it if you could come down to the station to answer some questions about your employment with Thomas Garrett. This is purely informational. You're not a suspect or person of interest in any way. We're simply trying to understand him better. Audrey agreed to come in the next morning. That evening, she met Serena at their old spot, a small Mexican restaurant on the edge of town where they'd spent countless hours as teenagers, dreaming about their futures, making plans that seemed so certain then. Now they sat across from each other in a corner booth, picking at chips and salsa, trying to find words for feelings that exceeded language. Do you remember the summer after Elena disappeared? Serena asked. How scared everyone was. How parents wouldn't let their kids go anywhere alone. How the whole town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for another girl to vanish. Audrey remembered. She remembered her own mother's fear, the new rules about curfews and check-ins, the way every car that drove too slowly past the elementary school became suspect, every stranger a potential predator. The whole community had been traumatized, transformed by fear into a place where children no longer ran free through the desert, where trust died and was replaced by vigilance. We thought it was someone passing through, Serena continued. A drifter, a stranger. That's what everyone said. It had to be someone from outside because nobody from here would do something like that. Nobody we knew could be capable of such evil. But it was someone we knew, Audrey said quietly. Someone we all knew. Someone we trusted. That's what I can't get past. Serena's eyes were bright with unshed tears. How many times did I go into that hardware store with my dad? How many times did Tom Garrett ruffle my hair and call me kiddo and ask about school? He knew I was Elena's friend. He knew what her disappearance did to our families. And he still looked me in the eye and smiled and acted like he cared. Audrey reached across the table and took Serena's hand. They sat like that for a while, two women trying to reconcile their childhoods with the truth that was now unavoidable, inescapable, seared into their understanding of the world. The restaurant door opened and Audrey looked up to see more familiar faces entering. People from their high school class, people who had grown up in the shadow of Elena's disappearance, people who needed the same thing Audrey and Serena needed. Community, connection, the reassurance that they weren't processing this alone. By the time they left, the booth had filled with 8 people, all of them talking in low, urgent voices about the arrest, about their memories of Tom Garrett, about the funeral that Mrs. Torres was planning, about how to move forward when the ground beneath your feet had turned out to be quicksand all along. Audrey drove home through the dark desert, the stars impossibly bright above her, the night air flowing through her open windows. She thought about Elena, about the girl who had tutored her in math, who had smelled like jasmine, who had dreamed of becoming a doctor. She thought about that girl's final moments. Had she known what was happening? Had she been afraid? Had she called out for help that never came? And she thought about Tom Garrett, about the man who had taught her how to splice electrical wire with steady hands, who had told her she would do something important with her life. What had he been thinking as he said those words? Had some part of him felt guilt? Remorse? Or had he been so practiced at deception that he felt nothing at all, just the smooth satisfaction of maintaining his performance? In her apartment, Audrey finally opened her laptop and began to write. She didn't know why exactly, maybe just to process, to externalize the chaos inside her head, to create some kind of order from the disorder. She wrote about her memories of working at Garrett's Hardware, about the skills she'd learned, about the version of Tom Garrett she'd known. She wrote about Elena, about the loss that had defined her adolescence, about the hole that had existed in the center of their community for 24 years. She wrote until her eyes burned and her fingers ached, until the first light of dawn began to creep through her window, until she had filled dozens of pages with words that might never make sense of the senseless but at least gave her somewhere to put the weight she was carrying. And then she closed the laptop, lay down without bothering to change clothes, and finally fell into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. Detective Sarah Morales was younger than Audrey expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and an economy of movement that suggested competence and focus. She met Audrey in a small interview room at the sheriff's department, offering coffee that Audrey declined, her stomach already too acidic with anxiety. "Thank you for coming in," Detective Morales said, settling into her chair with a folder in front of her. "I want to reiterate that you're not under investigation. We're talking to everyone who had significant contact with Thomas Garrett over the years. We're trying to understand patterns of behavior, any inconsistencies, anything that might have been overlooked or dismissed at the time." Audrey nodded. "I understand. You worked for Mr. Garrett from June 2006 to August 2009? Is that correct?" "Yes. I started the summer after my sophomore year of high school. Part-time during school, full-time in summers. I left when I went to college." "What was your impression of him as an employer?" Audrey took a breath. "He was good, fair. He paid above minimum wage, gave regular raises. He taught me a lot about customer service, about business operations. He was patient when I made mistakes, encouraged me to ask questions." Detective Morales wrote something in her notebook. "Did he ever behave inappropriately toward you or anyone else you witnessed?" "No, never." "Did he ever discuss Elena Torres with you?" The question landed like a stone in still water. "A few times. I mean, everyone in town talked about Elena, especially around the anniversary of her disappearance. He always seemed sympathetic, sad about it. He'd talk about how tragic it was, how he hoped her family would find peace someday." "Did he ever seem particularly interested in the case? In the investigation?" Audrey thought carefully. "No more than anyone else. Actually, less than some people. There were customers who would come in and want to discuss every theory, every rumor. Tom usually shut those conversations down. He'd say it was disrespectful to speculate, that we should let the investigators do their work." Detective Morales made another note. "Did you ever observe any unusual behavior? Unexplained absences, mood changes, suspicious activities?" "No. He was consistent, reliable. He opened the store at the same time every day, closed at the same time. He was steady." And that was the problem, Audrey realized as she said it. Tom Garrett had been so steady, so reliable, so utterly normal that no one had ever thought to question him. He'd hidden in plain sight, protected by his own ordinariness, by the trust he'd spent decades cultivating. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. Detective Morales asked about specific incidents, specific days, specific customers. She asked about Tom's relationship with his wife, his children, his business partners. She asked about the storage areas in the hardware store, about whether Audrey had ever noticed anything unusual in the back rooms, the basement, the alley behind the building. Audrey answered honestly. She'd never seen anything remotely suspicious. She'd never had any reason to question Tom Garrett's character or integrity. She'd been, like everyone else, completely deceived. "One last question," Detective Morales said as they wrapped up. "Knowing what you know now, is there anything, any moment, however small, that stands out in retrospect? Any conversation or incident that feels different now?" Audrey sat with the question, mining her memories one more time. And then, slowly, something surfaced. There was one thing, maybe nothing, but it was July 2008, the 8th anniversary of Elena's disappearance. Someone had organized another vigil at the park, and there was a lot of media coverage because of the anniversary. The Phoenix news stations sent reporters. It was a big event. And Tom closed the store early so everyone could attend. But he didn't go. He said he had inventory to do, that he'd pay his respects privately. I remember thinking it was a little odd because he usually showed up to community events. But I figured maybe he was just tired or busy, or maybe attending those vigils was too painful after so many years. I didn't think much of it at the time. Detective Morales's pen moved quickly across her notebook. Did he seem agitated that day? Nervous? Not really. Maybe a little quieter than usual. But again, it was a somber day. Everyone was quieter. After the interview, Audrey walked out into the harsh midday sun feeling hollowed out, like she'd been scraped clean from the inside. Other people were waiting in the lobby. Faces she recognized from around town, former employees, business associates, all of them here to give their pieces of the puzzle that was Thomas Garrett's double life. She saw Danny Ortiz, who had worked alongside her at the hardware store, now in his early 30s with a wedding ring and tired eyes. He gave her a small nod of recognition but didn't approach. What was there to say? They'd both been fooled. They'd both trusted a murderer and never suspected a thing. Outside, the media presence had intensified. More news vans lined the street. A reporter Audrey vaguely recognized from the Phoenix ABC affiliate was doing a stand-up in front of the building, speaking earnestly into the camera about a community in crisis and 24 years of deception finally coming to light. Audrey kept her head down and walked quickly to her car, but she wasn't fast enough. "Ms. Ramirez." Audrey Ramirez. A young reporter with aggressive determination in her eyes hurried toward her, microphone extended. "You worked for Thomas Garrett. Can you comment on what he was like as an employer? Did you ever suspect anything?" "No comment," Audrey said, fumbling with her keys. "The community wants to know how someone could hide such evil for so long. What was your experience?" I said no comment. Audrey got her car door open and slid inside, locking it immediately. The reporter hovered for a moment, then retreated to find easier prey. Audrey's hands shook on the steering wheel. She took several deep breaths before starting the engine, trying to calm the panic rising in her chest. This was going to be her life now, at least for a while. She was part of the story whether she wanted to be or not, connected forever to Tom Garrett through the simple fact of having worked for him, having trusted him, having been one of the many people he'd deceived. Her phone rang. Her father. "I'm okay, Dad," she said before he could ask. "The interview? It was fine. Professional. They're just gathering information. Your mother and I are heading to the Torres house this afternoon. Mrs. Torres is receiving visitors. We thought, well, it seemed like the right thing to do. You want to come with us?" Audrey did, though the thought terrified her. What did you say to a woman who had just discovered the identity of her daughter's killer after 24 years? What words could possibly be adequate? But she went. Because her father was right, it was the right thing to do. The Torres house was modest. A small ranch-style home with a carefully tended garden that Mrs. Torres had maintained obsessively over the years, something to focus on during the endless waiting. Now the driveway and street were packed with cars, and people flowed in and out of the front door in a steady stream, bringing food and flowers and their complicated grief. Inside, the house was almost exactly as Audrey remembered from childhood, when she'd come here occasionally with her mother. The same furniture, the same family photos on the walls. But now, dominating the living room, was a large portrait of Elena at 17, her smile luminous, her eyes bright with dreams that would never be realized. Mrs. Torres sat in an armchair near the window, looking impossibly small and fragile. She was in her 60s now, but grief and revelation had aged her beyond her years. Her sister stood beside her, a protective presence, managing the flow of visitors. When Audrey approached with her parents, Mrs. Torres looked up, and something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, memory, connection. "Audrey," she said softly. "Little Audrey. Not so little anymore. Mrs. Torres." Audrey knelt beside the chair, taking the older woman's hand. "I'm so sorry. For Elena. For everything. You worked for him. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact." "I did. I'm so sorry. I never knew. I never suspected." Mrs. Torres squeezed Audrey's hand with surprising strength. "Of course you didn't. How could you? He fooled everyone. That was his gift, apparently. The ability to fool people. To make us trust him while he carried that terrible secret." Her voice broke. "Do you know what haunts me most? That he helped search for her. He stood in my kitchen. Right there." She pointed to the doorway. "And he drank my coffee and he told me not to give up hope. And all the while he knew she was dead. He knew where she was buried. And he looked me in the eye and lied." Audrey felt tears streaming down her face. "I wish I could have seen it. I wish any of us could have seen it. But that's the thing about people like him," Mrs. Torres said, her voice gaining strength, hardening with something like anger. "They count on our goodness. They count on us not being suspicious, on us believing the best about people, on us extending trust and kindness. And they weaponize those things. They use our own decency against us." Audrey's mother stepped forward, embracing Mrs. Torres, and the two women held each other for a long moment, sharing the particular grief of mothers. One who had lost a daughter to violence, another who had raised children in the shadow of that violence, never knowing the threat was hidden behind a friendly smile at the hardware store. The afternoon stretched on. Audrey listened to conversations happening all around her, people processing their shock and anger and betrayal. She heard stories she'd never known before, how Tom Garrett had donated money to the Elena Torres Memorial Scholarship Fund every year, how he'd attended the dedication of the memorial bench in the park where Elena used to study, how he'd been on the committee that approved the street renaming in her honor. Each revelation was like another small knife wound. The performance had been so thorough, so complete. He hadn't just hidden his crime. He'd actively participated in the mourning, the memorializing, the community's collective grief. He'd woven himself into the narrative of Elena's disappearance as one of the caring neighbors, the concerned citizens, the people who refused to give up hope. It was monstrous. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Audrey's phone buzzed with a text from Serena. "Turn on channel 3. They're interviewing Garrett's daughter." Audrey excused herself and went outside to her car, where she pulled up a live stream on her phone. The interview was already in progress. Jennifer Garrett, now Jennifer Morrison, married with 2 kids of her own, sat stiffly in front of the camera, her face carefully composed but her eyes red from crying. "I don't know what to say," Jennifer was telling the reporter. "That's my father. The man who taught me to ride a bike, who came to every softball game, who walked me down the aisle at my wedding. I can't reconcile that person with what he's accused of doing. I'm devastated for Elena's family. I'm devastated for our community. And I'm devastated for my own family, for my children who have to grow up knowing their grandfather is..." She stopped, unable to continue. "Do you believe he did it?" the reporter asked. Jennifer's face crumpled. "The evidence says yes. The DNA says yes. But my heart doesn't know how to accept it. How do you accept that someone you love is capable of something so evil?" It was the question everyone was asking. Audrey watched the rest of the interview, feeling a complicated sympathy for Jennifer. She was a victim too in her own way. She'd lost her father, not to death, but to the revelation of who he truly was. Her entire history had been rewritten, every memory now contaminated with the knowledge of what he'd done. That evening, Audrey met with a small group of people who'd worked at Garrett's Hardware over the years. They gathered at Danny Ortiz's house. His wife, Maria, had insisted they needed to talk, to process together rather than in isolation. There were 6 of them. Audrey, Danny, Maria, Rebecca Torres, no relation to Elena, though the shared last name had always felt significant in Maricopa, James Chan, Mrs. Chen's nephew, and Paul Davidson, who had worked part-time during his retirement years. They sat in Danny's living room, drinking coffee and beer, looking at each other with shell-shocked expressions. "I keep going over everything," Rebecca said. "Every conversation, every interaction. Was he watching me? Was he assessing me somehow? Thinking about—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "We were kids," Danny said. "Most of us were teenagers when we worked there. High school students, college students on summer break. Young women working the register. And we never felt unsafe. Isn't that crazy? We never once felt unsafe. Because he never gave us reason to," Paul said. The older man's voice was heavy with something like guilt. "I'm 72 years old. I've been around. I thought I could read people. But I worked next to that man for 5 years, and I never saw anything wrong. Not a damn thing. The police asked me about the basement," James said quietly. "Whether I'd ever been down there, whether I'd seen anything unusual. I went down there all the time to get stock, to organize inventory. It was just a basement. Shelves, boxes, the usual stuff. There was nothing sinister about it." "Maybe that's what made him so effective," Maria suggested. She was studying criminal psychology at ASU and had come home for the summer when the news broke. Psychopaths, if that's what he is, are often extremely good at compartmentalization. They can commit terrible acts and then go home and have dinner with their family and feel nothing. No guilt, no anxiety. They can pass polygraphs because they genuinely don't have the stress response that normal people do when they lie. "So he's just a monster," Rebecca said. "Evil wearing a human face." "I don't know if it's that simple," Maria replied. "Which almost makes it worse, doesn't it? If we could just label him monster and other and not like us, that would be easier. But he was like us. He had a family, a business, friends. He was woven into the community. He was normal right up until he wasn't. They talked late into the night, sharing memories, comparing notes, trying to find patterns they'd missed. But there was nothing. Tom Garrett had been a model employer, a respected businessman, a decent neighbor, right up until the moment they discovered he'd been a murderer all along. The next day, the preliminary hearing was scheduled. Audrey didn't attend. The courtroom was small, and priority seating went to Elena's family and direct stakeholders in the case. But she watched the live stream from her apartment, unable to look away even though every moment felt like swallowing glass. Tom Garrett appeared in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked older than Audrey remembered, his face gray and haggard, his shoulders slumped. When the judge asked how he pleaded, he said, in a voice barely audible, "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Elena's family members cried out. The judge called for order. Tom's attorney, a high-powered defense lawyer from Phoenix named Richard Castellano, stood and began making arguments about circumstantial evidence, about reasonable doubt, about his client's presumption of innocence. But the prosecutor, District Attorney Catherine Reeves, was ready. She outlined the evidence methodically. DNA from bone samples that matched material found in Tom Garrett's possession. Fibers from Elena's clothing found in a storage unit that had belonged to Garrett's mother-in-law but which he'd had access to. Digital forensics showing searches on his computer in the weeks after Elena's disappearance. Searches for decomposition rates, desert burial sites, police investigation techniques. And then the bombshell. A witness who claimed Tom Garrett had confessed to them years ago, in a moment of drunken weakness, but who had been too afraid to come forward at the time. The courtroom fell silent as DA Reeves described this witness. She didn't name them, citing safety concerns, but said they were credible. Their testimony was corroborated by other evidence, and they would be testifying at trial. Tom Garrett's face went even grayer. His attorney leaned in to whisper urgently to him. The judge set a trial date for October and denied bail, citing flight risk and the severity of the charges. As they led Tom Garrett out of the courtroom, he looked directly at the camera. Looked, it seemed, straight at everyone watching, and for just a moment Audrey thought she saw something flicker across his face. Not remorse. Not guilt. Something colder. Something calculating. And then it was gone, and he was just an old man in handcuffs, being taken back to a cell where he would wait for justice that was 24 years overdue. That afternoon, the protests began. A group of about 30 people gathered outside the courthouse, some calling for the death penalty, others demanding accountability for everyone who had missed the signs, who had let Tom Garrett operate freely for decades. The protest was peaceful but intense, voices raised in anger and grief. By evening, it had grown to over 100 people. Local news covered it live. National news started picking up the story. Maricopa, population 8,000, suddenly found itself in the spotlight, a symbol of something larger, the predators who hide in plain sight, the evil that wears a friendly face, the communities that have to reckon with the monsters they never knew they were harboring. Audrey stood on her apartment balcony and watched the desert sunset, the sky bleeding red and orange across the horizon. Somewhere out there, in that vast expanse of sand and stone and silence, Elena Torres had been buried for 24 years. The desert had kept that secret, held it close, waited patiently for the truth to surface. Her grandmother had been right. The desert remembered everything. And now, finally, so did they. The witness came forward publicly 2 weeks later. Her name was Christine Palmer, and she was 53 years old, a former bartender at Lucky's Tavern, a dive bar on the outskirts of Maricopa that had closed down 5 years ago. She'd moved to Nevada shortly after the bar closed, had built a quiet life for herself in a small town outside Reno, and had carried Tom Garrett's confession like a stone in her chest for 17 years. When she held her press conference, flanked by DA Reeves and victim advocates, her hands shook so badly she could barely read her prepared statement. In 2007, she said, her voice thin but determined, Tom Garrett came into Lucky's on a Tuesday night in November. It was slow, just him and a couple of regulars. He drank more than I'd ever seen him drink before, and he started talking. At first it was just rambling, about pressure, about mistakes, about how you can't take back certain things no matter how much you wish you could. Christine paused, taking a shaky breath. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "That Torres girl, Elena, everyone thinks she ran away or got grabbed by some drifter. But what if she didn't? What if it was someone who knew better? Someone who panicked and made it all worse?" I asked him what he meant, and he just stared at me with these empty eyes and said, "Sometimes good people do terrible things, and then they have to live with it forever." The room was absolutely silent except for the click of cameras. I asked him directly if he was saying he knew something about Elena's disappearance. He got this look on his face, like he just realized what he'd said, and he shut down completely, paid his tab, left, never came back to the bar. I convinced myself I'd misunderstood, that he'd been drunk and talking nonsense. But it haunted me. For years it haunted me. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" a reporter called out. Christine's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was afraid. Tom Garrett was a powerful man in this community. I was a single mother working minimum wage. Who was going to believe me? And what if I was wrong? What if I'd misinterpreted a drunk man's rambling? I told myself I didn't have enough, that it wasn't really a confession, that I was just being paranoid. I told myself a lot of things to make the guilt go away." She looked directly at the cameras. "But when I saw the news about his arrest, when I saw that DNA evidence had connected him to Elena's murder, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I'm so sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I'm so sorry to Elena's family. Maybe if I'd been braver." DA Reeves put a hand on Christine's shoulder. "Ms. Palmer has shown tremendous courage in coming forward now. Her testimony, combined with the physical evidence we've gathered, paints a clear picture of what happened to Elena Torres." Over the next weeks, more pieces emerged. Forensic analysts revealed that Elena's remains showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. She'd been killed quickly, likely in a moment of violence rather than prolonged suffering. That was small comfort, but Mrs. Torres clung to it anyway. Her daughter hadn't suffered long. That was something. The timeline began to take shape. July 23, 2000, Elena had left her shift at the Desert Rose Diner at 10:30 p.m. Security footage from a gas station 3 miles away showed her car passing by at 10:47 p.m. Then nothing until her abandoned vehicle was found at 6:15 a.m. the next morning on Highway 347. But new evidence showed that Tom Garrett's truck had been spotted on a back road near where Elena's car was found at approximately 11 p.m. that night. A traffic camera that no one had thought to check in 2000 because who would have suspected Tom Garrett had captured his license plate. The footage had been archived, forgotten, until cold case detectives went back through everything with fresh eyes and new technology. Then there were the items found in the storage unit. Elena's silver hoop earrings, a necklace her mother had given her for her quinceañera, a small notebook she'd used for studying, with her handwriting still visible on the pages. And most damning, a piece of fabric that DNA analysis matched to both Elena and Tom Garrett. He'd kept souvenirs, trophies. Just like Christine Palmer's testimony suggested, he'd lived with what he'd done, but he'd also held on to physical reminders, unable to fully let go of the control, the power, the secret knowledge that he'd gotten away with murder. The community's reckoning deepened with each revelation. The hardware store remained closed, its windows still broken, graffiti accumulating on its walls like layers of accusation. Tom Garrett's house, where his wife Susan had lived for 36 years, was empty now, Susan having fled to her sister's place and filed for divorce through her attorney. The house just sat there, dark and silent, a monument to all the ordinary life that had been lived there while murder went unacknowledged in the bones of the man who mowed the lawn and paid the mortgage and kissed his wife goodnight. Audrey attended a community healing circle organized by local churches and mental health professionals. Over 200 people showed up, filling the high school gymnasium, all of them trying to process the collective trauma, trying to find language for the betrayal they felt. A therapist named Dr. Marcus Williams facilitated. "What you're all experiencing is a form of collective trauma," he explained. "When someone you trusted, someone woven into the fabric of your community, is revealed to have committed such a heinous act, it shakes your foundational assumptions about safety, about trustworthiness, about your own judgment. You're not just grieving for Elena, though that grief is profound and valid. You're also grieving the loss of the community you thought you had, the person you thought Tom Garrett was, and your own sense of certainty about the world." People shared their stories. A woman stood up and said she'd bought the screws to install her daughter's car seat from Tom Garrett, had trusted his advice about which ones were safest. A man talked about how Tom had helped him build a wheelchair ramp for his elderly mother, had refused payment, had just wanted to help. A teacher described how Tom had donated supplies for her classroom every year, had shown such genuine interest in the children's education. Each story was an act of excavation, unearthing the complicated truth. That Tom Garrett had done good things, had helped people, had been genuinely kind in many contexts, and had also murdered a teenage girl and hidden it for 24 years. Both things were true. Holding both truths simultaneously was almost unbearable. Mrs. Chun spoke, her voice trembling. "I've taught in this community for 42 years. I've seen generations of children grow up. And one thing I've learned is that people are complicated. But there's complicated and then there's evil. What Tom Garrett did to Elena, and then the decades of deception, that's evil. We can acknowledge that he did some good things while also being clear that those good things don't excuse or diminish the terrible thing he did. We don't have to choose between demonizing him completely or defending him. We can hold the complexity while still demanding justice." The room erupted in applause. It felt like permission to be angry, permission to feel betrayed, permission to grieve multiple losses at once. Audrey found herself standing, her heart pounding. "I worked for Tom Garrett for 3 years. He taught me skills I still use. He encouraged me when I doubted myself. He wrote me a recommendation letter for college. And I hate that those things happened, because they're now forever tainted by what he did. I can't remember those moments without also remembering that he was a murderer. It feels like my own history has been poisoned." Serena stood up next to her, taking her hand. "And that's part of his crime too. He didn't just kill Elena. He stole her future, he tortured her family for decades, and he corrupted every relationship he had, every kindness he showed. He made all of us complicit without our knowledge or consent. He used our trust as his shield. So yes, be angry, be furious, and then let's figure out how to rebuild. The healing circle lasted 3 hours. People cried, shouted, embraced. They formed small groups, exchanging phone numbers, promising to check in on each other. The trauma was communal, so the healing would have to be communal too. Later that week, DA Reeves released more information about the case, preparing the public for trial. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA, the physical items, Christine Palmer's testimony, the traffic camera footage, and forensic analysis of Tom Garrett's computer showing searches for "How long does DNA last in desert soil?" and statute of limitations murder in the months after Elena's disappearance. There was also a handwritten note found in Tom Garrett's home office, tucked into a file labeled "Personal." The note read, "Some mistakes you can't undo. Some choices you can't take back. You just have to live with them and pretend you're still a good person. Pretend long enough and maybe it becomes true. Or maybe you just get better at lying." The note wasn't dated, but handwriting analysis confirmed it was written by Tom Garrett, likely several years after Elena's murder. When this information went public, something shifted in the community's response. The anger remained, but it was joined by something else, a kind of horrified fascination with the psychology of it all. How did someone commit murder and then just continue? How did they coach Little League and serve on the town council and donate to charities, all while carrying that knowledge? Psychologists appeared on news programs to explain. Compartmentalization, rationalization, narcissistic personality traits, the ability to construct narratives where one was always the victim or the hero, never the villain. But for Audrey, for Mrs. Torres, for everyone who had been close to the situation, these clinical explanations felt insufficient. They described the mechanism but not the meaning, explained the how but not the why, defined the pathology but couldn't capture the profound betrayal of someone using a community's goodness as camouflage for evil. Elena's funeral was held on a Saturday in early April. The original service in 2000 had been a memorial without a body, hope and grief intertwined. This service was different. A burial, a final goodbye, an ending after 24 years of suspension. The entire town showed up. The church was packed, with overflow crowds listening via speakers set up outside. Elena's casket was covered in white roses, her favorite flower, her mother remembered. Mrs. Torres, supported by her sister and her surviving children, sat in the front pew, her face composed but her eyes distant, looking at something the rest of them couldn't see. The Elena Torres Memorial Scholarship Fund received an influx of donations. The town council voted to name the new community center in her honor. Her story was taught in local schools as part of lessons about violence prevention, about speaking up when something feels wrong, about the importance of forensic science in solving crimes. And slowly, carefully, the community began to trust again. Not blindly, that innocence was lost forever, but in a more conscious way, recognizing that while evil could hide behind friendly faces, most people truly were who they appeared to be. The tragedy hadn't destroyed Maricopa's sense of community. It had transformed it into something more resilient, more aware, more intentional. Audrey found her own path to healing through her work. She'd been considering a career change before the arrest, thinking about going back to school for a master's in social work. Now she was certain. She wanted to work with crime victims, with families navigating the criminal justice system, with communities trying to heal from collective trauma. She applied to ASU's program and was accepted. When she told her parents, her mother cried, happy tears this time. "Elena would be proud," she said. "Look at how you've taken something terrible and chosen to make meaning from it." But Audrey knew it wasn't that simple. She was still working through her own complicated feelings about Tom Garrett, about the mentorship he'd provided, about the ways his guidance had shaped her. Some days she felt angry, furious at him for making her doubt her own judgment, for tainting her memories. Other days she felt a strange kind of grief for the person she'd thought he was, for the loss of that stable, reliable presence in her formative years. Therapy helped. Dr. Williams, who had facilitated the community healing circle, became Audrey's regular therapist. He helped her understand that she could hold multiple truths simultaneously, that Tom Garrett had taught her real skills and also that he was a murderer, that some of her memories of him could remain valuable even though the person she remembered had never really existed, that she wasn't responsible for failing to see what he'd so carefully hidden. Predators are good at what they do, Dr. Williams told her during one session. They don't survive by being obvious. They survive by being exactly what people want and need them to be. Tom Garrett was a chameleon who spent decades perfecting his disguise. The fact that you didn't see through it isn't a failing on your part. It's a testament to his skill at deception. But shouldn't I have sensed something? Audrey asked. Some instinct? Some feeling that something was off? Maybe, or maybe not. The human brain is remarkable at pattern recognition, but it's not infallible. And when someone spends decades being consistently good, consistently helpful, consistently normal, your brain has no reason to flag them as dangerous. That's why people like him are so dangerous. They understand how to exploit our assumptions and our trust. 2 years after the conviction, Audrey graduated with her master's degree. She took a job with a victim advocacy organization based in Phoenix but serving rural Arizona communities. Her work brought her back to Maricopa regularly, where she helped families navigate the aftermath of crimes, connected them with resources, and facilitated support groups for people dealing with trauma. She often thought about Elena, about the doctor she'd never become, about all the patients she might have helped, all the lives she might have touched. And Audrey tried, in her own small way, to honor that unrealized potential by helping others find their way through darkness into some semblance of light. Serena took a different path, but one equally shaped by Elena's legacy. She became a criminal justice reform advocate, focusing on cold case investigations and the importance of preserving evidence with advancing technology in mind. She testified before the state legislature about funding for cold case units, about training for law enforcement on recognizing predatory patterns, about the long-term impacts of unsolved crimes on communities. Elena's case shows us that justice can come even after decades, Serena said at one legislative hearing Audrey attended. But it shouldn't take 24 years. We need better systems, better resources, better training. We need to believe victims and witnesses when they come forward, even if the person they're accusing seems impossible to suspect. We need to question our assumptions about who can commit terrible crimes, because the answer is anyone. Even the nice man who runs the hardware store. The legislation passed. Arizona allocated additional funding for cold case units across the state, implemented new protocols for evidence preservation, and created a database for tracking patterns across jurisdictions. It was called Elena's Law, and Mrs. Torres was present when the governor signed it, tears streaming down her face as she held a framed photo of her daughter. Something good, she whispered to Audrey, who had come to the signing ceremony. Something good from something so terrible. 3 years after the conviction, on what would have been Elena's 45th birthday, the community held a different kind of remembrance. Not a somber vigil, but a celebration of life. They gathered at the newly named Elena Torres Community Center, where local artists had created a mural depicting Elena as she'd been, young, vibrant, full of dreams, but also showing the ripples of her legacy. The students who'd received scholarships in her name, the cold cases that had been solved because of improved forensic techniques, the community that had learned to be both more cautious and more compassionate. Mrs. Torres, now in her early 70s but looking healthier than she had in years, stood before the mural with her family. Her surviving children were there with their own kids. Elena's nieces and nephews who had never met her but knew her story, carried her memory, understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. My daughter's life was cut short, Mrs. Torres said to the assembled crowd. But her impact has extended far beyond her 17 years. Every student who received a scholarship in her name and went on to help others, that's Elena's legacy. Every cold case that gets solved because of better forensic science, that's Elena's legacy. Every person in this community who learned to speak up when something feels wrong, who learned that evil can hide behind ordinary faces, that's Elena's legacy too. She paused, looking at the mural, at her daughter's painted smile. Tom Garrett tried to erase her, to bury her in silence. But we didn't let him. We remembered her. We fought for her. We made sure her name meant something beyond just tragedy. And that's how we truly defeat people like him, not just by putting them in prison, but by refusing to let them define the story. Elena's story isn't about how she died. It's about how she lived, and how we chose to honor that life. The crowd applauded. Children released biodegradable balloons into the Arizona sky, each one carrying a message of hope or remembrance. A mariachi band played Elena's favorite songs. Her mother had remembered them all these years, had held on to every detail of her daughter's preferences and dreams. The community center hosted workshops on self-defense, on supporting trauma survivors, on building resilient communities. It was a day. That event had shaped her entire adolescence and young adulthood, how the mystery had haunted her dreams and influenced her choices. And now, resolution. Not the neat, clean resolution of movies or books, but the messy, complicated resolution of real life, where answers generated new questions, where justice came with its own costs, where healing was nonlinear and ongoing. You did good work. Her fed off both grief and celebration, of remembering loss while also acknowledging growth. Audrey stood with her parents and Marcus, watching the balloons drift upward into the endless blue. She thought about the 11-year-old girl she'd been when Elena disappeared. Howher said quietly, his hand on her shoulder. He'd retired from the sheriff's department the year before, finally ready to step away after 40 years in law enforcement. With your advocacy work, helping people navigate what we all went through, making something positive from it. We all did, Audrey replied. The whole community. We could have turned inward, become paranoid and broken. But we chose differently. Her mother added, and that's what community means, really. Not just the good times, the potlucks and parades, but how you come together when something terrible happens. How you hold each other up. How you decide who you want to be in the aftermath. Later, as the sun began to set and the celebration wound down, Audrey found herself standing alone for a moment near the mural. She looked at Elena's painted face, frozen forever at 17, and she spoke quietly, knowing it was symbolic but needing to say it anyway. I'm sorry we didn't find the truth sooner. I'm sorry you had to wait so long for justice. But I promise you, we made sure you weren't forgotten. We made sure your life mattered. We made sure that something good came from something terrible. I hope that means something, wherever you are. The wind picked up, typical of Arizona evenings, carrying the scent of creosote and dust. Audrey took it as answer enough. 4 years after the conviction, Audrey was leading a support group for families of cold case victims when she got a call from Detective Morales. They'd stayed in touch over the years, Morales occasionally consulting with Audrey on victim advocacy aspects of cases she was working. I wanted you to hear this from me first, Morales said. Tom Garrett died this morning. Heart attack. He was 62. Audrey sat down slowly, processing. How do you feel? Morales asked. I don't know, Audrey admitted. Relief? Anger that he got to die relatively easily when Elena didn't? Sadness for his family? All of it at once. That's normal. Death doesn't erase what he did, but it does close a chapter. I thought you should know before the news breaks. When Audrey told her support group, she'd learned that transparency and shared processing were more helpful than secrets. The reactions were varied. Some felt relief that he couldn't hurt anyone else. Some felt cheated that he hadn't served more time. Some felt nothing at all. His death just another fact in a complicated story. Mrs. Torres, when Audrey visited her later that week, was surprisingly philosophical. I won't pretend to grieve him, she said, but I also won't celebrate his death. He was a human being who did a monstrous thing. Now he's gone, and Elena is still gone, and all we have left is what we've built from the ashes. That's what matters. The community's response was similarly measured. There were no celebrations, but no vigils for Tom Garrett either. He'd been removed from the narrative as much as possible, not erased because that would be dishonest, but no longer centered. The story became Elena's story, not his. The focus became healing and prevention, not endless analysis of the perpetrator. His obituary in the local paper was brief, factual, notable for what it didn't say. His family held a private burial. His name faded from daily conversation, becoming instead a historical reference point. A cautionary tale, a reminder of why vigilance mattered and why justice, however delayed, was worth pursuing. 5 years after the conviction, Audrey published a memoir about her experience. Not just of working for Tom Garrett, but of navigating the aftermath of building a career from trauma, of learning to trust again. She debated whether to write it, worried about centering herself in Elena's story, but her editor convinced her that her perspective was valuable precisely because it was complicated. People need to understand that it's not just victims and perpetrators, her editor said. There's a whole community of people in between. People who knew the perpetrator, trusted him, were shaped by him. Your story helps people understand that moral landscape. The book was titled The Desert Remembers. A community confronts hidden evil. In it, Audrey was unflinchingly honest about her complicated feelings, about the good things Tom Garrett had taught her and how she'd learned to separate the lessons from the teacher, about the long process of rebuilding trust in her own judgment. The reviews were mostly positive. Some critics said she was too sympathetic to Garrett, others that she wasn't sympathetic enough. But survivors and family members of victims reached out to thank her, saying they'd felt seen, that someone had finally articulated the impossible complexity of loving someone who turned out to be terrible, or being helped by someone who also caused immeasurable harm. Mrs. Torres read it and called Audrey afterward. "Thank you," she said simply, "for telling the truth. All of it. The good and the bad and the confusing parts in between. That's what real life is." 6 years after the conviction, the first student to graduate from medical school on an Elena Torres Memorial Scholarship returned to Maricopa to open a family practice clinic. Her name was Sofia Rodriguez, and she'd been 12 years old when Elena disappeared, had grown up hearing the story, had decided to become the Dr. Elena never got to be. At the clinic's opening ceremony, Sofia spoke about legacy and inspiration. Elena Torres was going to be a doctor to give back to this community. "I'm here because of her, because of the scholarship that made medical school possible for a girl from a working-class family, because of the example she set even in death. Every patient I treat, every life I touch, that's Elena's legacy continuing." Mrs. Torres was there, cutting the ribbon, her eyes bright with tears but also with pride. This was the future she'd fought for, the meaning she'd demanded from tragedy. Her daughter's dreams hadn't died, they'd multiplied, spreading through scholarships and inspired young people who carried Elena's vision forward. Audrey attended the opening and watched Sofia examine her first patients in the new clinic. She thought about trajectories, about how one act of violence had sent ripples through time, touching hundreds of lives in ways both devastating and, surprisingly, redemptive. Tom Garrett had tried to destroy a future, but the community had built new futures instead, had refused to let his evil be the final word. 10 years later, Audrey stood in the Arizona State University auditorium, preparing to deliver a keynote speech to incoming students in the social work program. At 45, she'd built a career that felt meaningful, purposeful, born from trauma but not defined by it. She was the director of victim services for 3 rural Arizona counties now, overseeing programs that helped hundreds of families annually, training the next generation of advocates, consulting on policy that shaped how the justice system treated survivors. But tonight, she was here to talk about something more personal. How communities heal, how individuals rebuild, how meaning emerges from tragedy if you're brave enough to look for it. The auditorium filled with eager young faces, students who had chosen this path because they wanted to help people, because they believed in the possibility of healing, because they refused to accept that trauma had to be permanent. Audrey saw herself in them, or rather, she saw who she'd been at 22, before she knew how complicated the world truly was. "I'm going to tell you about a girl named Elena Torres," Audrey began, "and about a hardware store owner named Tom Garrett, and about a community that had to learn the hardest possible lesson about trust, betrayal, and the long road to justice." She told Elena's story. Not the sanitized version, but the full, complicated truth, the 24 years of mystery, the shock of the arrest, the evidence that proved beyond doubt that a pillar of the community was a murderer, the trial, the conviction, the years of healing that followed. She talked about her own relationship with Tom Garrett, about the mentorship that had shaped her, about the cognitive dissonance of reconciling the man who taught her valuable skills with the man who murdered a teenage girl. "You're going to encounter this complexity in your work," she told the students. You're going to meet perpetrators who are also fathers, husbands, community members. You're going to see survivors struggle with loving someone who harmed them. You're going to navigate systems that try to put people into simple categories, good or evil, victim or perpetrator, when real life is almost never that clean. She paused, looking out at the attentive faces. Your job isn't to simplify. Your job is to hold the complexity while still maintaining moral clarity. Tom Garrett did some good things and committed terrible evil. Both are true. The good doesn't excuse the evil, and the evil doesn't erase every positive interaction he had. As victim advocates, you have to be able to acknowledge that nuance while never losing sight of justice, of accountability, of the profound harm caused by violence. After the speech, students lined up to ask questions, to share their own stories, to seek guidance. Audrey stayed late, talking with each one, offering the wisdom she'd earned through experience, through mistakes, through the slow accumulation of understanding that came from doing difficult work over many years. One young woman, probably 23 or 24, waited until the end. "My uncle was arrested 2 years ago," she said quietly. "Sexual abuse of minors. He was my favorite uncle growing up. He taught me to fish, helped me with homework, was always there for family events. And now I have to hold both realities, the uncle I loved and the monster who hurt children. How do you do that? How do you not go crazy?" Audrey took the young woman's hands. "You practice. Every day. You remind yourself that people are complicated, that someone can be genuinely good in one context and genuinely harmful in another. You grieve the person you thought he was. You support the survivors. And you find meaning where you can, maybe by becoming an advocate, by helping other people navigate what you're navigating. That's what I did. That's what got me through." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for being honest about it, for not pretending it's simple." 15 years later, the documentary premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to critical acclaim. The Desert Remembers. The Elena Torres case was a comprehensive examination of the murder, the investigation, the decades of mystery, and the community's response to the eventual resolution. The director had interviewed everyone. Mrs. Torres, now in her 80s but still sharp, Audrey, Serena, Detective Morales, who had retired but remained passionate about cold case work, Christine Palmer, who had moved back to Arizona and become an advocate for witnesses who were afraid to come forward. The film didn't sensationalize. It didn't linger on gore or exploitation. Instead, it focused on the human impact, the ripple effects, the ways that one act of violence in 2000 had shaped lives and choices decades later. It showed the Elena Torres Memorial Scholarship recipients, now doctors, lawyers, teachers, social workers, all of them carrying forward the dreams of a girl they'd never met. It showed the community center, thriving with programs that serve thousands. It showed the changes in forensic science and cold case investigation that Elena's case had helped inspire. And it showed Tom Garrett's family, his daughter Jennifer, now in her 50s, speaking with painful honesty about the process of disowning her father while grieving the loss of who she'd thought he was. His ex-wife Susan, who had never remarried, who had spent 15 years rebuilding her identity separate from her husband's crimes. His grandchildren, who had learned their grandfather's story and had to decide how to integrate that knowledge into their own identities. "You don't get to choose your family," Jennifer said in the documentary. "But you do get to choose whether you let their actions define you. I'm not my father. I'm horrified by what he did. And I've spent years in therapy trying to reconcile the dad who pushed me on swings with the man who murdered Elena. I don't know if I'll ever fully reconcile it. But I've learned to live with the ambiguity." The film won awards. It was screened in schools, used in criminal justice courses, discussed in community forums about violence prevention and collective trauma. Elena's story reached millions of people, became a touchstone for conversations about hidden predators, delayed justice, and the possibility of healing. Mrs. Torres watched it once, at a private screening with her family. Afterward, she told the director, "You honored her. You made her a person, not just a victim. Thank you." 20 years later, Audrey was 60 now, white-haired and tired in the good way that came from a life fully lived. She'd retired from her formal position but still did consulting work, still led occasional workshops, still showed up when communities needed someone who understood the specific pain of betrayal by someone trusted. She was in Maricopa for the 20th anniversary of Tom Garrett's conviction, the 40th anniversary of Elena's murder. The community had organized a remembrance event, not mournful but celebratory, celebrating Elena's life, celebrating justice achieved, celebrating the resilience of a community that had been wounded but not destroyed. The Elena Torres Community Center was packed. Mrs. Torres had passed away 2 years earlier, at 83, finally at peace. But her children and grandchildren were there, carrying on her legacy, ensuring Elena's story continued to be told. The scholarship fund had grown to over $2 million. 47 students had graduated from medical school on Elena Torres scholarships, with 30 more currently enrolled. Serena, now in her 50s and a state legislator focused on criminal justice reform, gave a speech about the policy changes that had emerged from Elena's case. Detective Morales, frail but determined at 78, spoke about the importance of never giving up on cold cases. Dr. Sofia Rodriguez, who had built her clinic into a thriving practice serving underserved communities, talked about carrying forward Elena's dream of giving back. And Audrey stood before the crowd and said, "The desert remembers everything. That's what my grandmother used to tell me." The desert remembered where Elena was buried, held that secret until technology and determination and courage brought it to light. But people remember too. We remember Elena, not just how she died, but how she lived. We remember the lessons her case taught us about vigilance, about speaking up, about believing survivors and witnesses even when the accused seems impossible to suspect. She looked out at the crowd, 3 generations of Maricopa residents, some who remembered 2000, others too young to have lived through it but carrying the story anyway. Tom Garrett has been dead for 16 years. His name is mostly forgotten, which is as it should be. But Elena's name lives on. In this building, in medical clinics across Arizona, in policy reforms and cold case investigations, in every person who learned from her story and chose to make the world a little bit safer, a little bit more, just a little bit more compassionate. That's how we defeat evil, not just by punishing it, but by building something beautiful in response to it. The crowd rose in applause. Outside, the Arizona sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, the desert stretching endlessly in all directions, holding its secrets, remembering everything, patient and eternal. That evening, Audrey drove out to the cemetery where Elena was buried. She did this sometimes, not often but occasionally, when she needed to reconnect with the reason she'd chosen this work, this life, this path. Elena's headstone was simple but beautiful, with fresh flowers always present. The scholarship recipients took turns, ensuring their benefactor was never without blooms. Audrey sat on the bench nearby and spoke quietly to the desert silence. "You'd be 61 now. You'd probably be a grandmother. Maybe you'd have become chief of medicine at some hospital, or opened a clinic like Sophia did, or gone into research or taught the next generation of doctors. All those futures that should have been yours." A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents. "But your one life has touched hundreds of others. That has to count for something, Elena. It doesn't make your death okay. It doesn't excuse what was stolen from you. But it means your life mattered. Means you made a difference even in absence. And that's what I've tried to do. Make sure your death meant something beyond just tragedy. Make sure the desert didn't remember alone." The sun touched the horizon. Audrey stood, brushed off her pants, and walked back to her car. She had dinner plans with Serena, with Marcus and his family, with the community of people who had grown up in the shadow of Elena's disappearance and had chosen to build light instead of dwelling in darkness. As she drove back toward town, past the spot where Elena's car had been found so many years ago, past Garrett's Hardware, which was now a community arts center, past the high school where Elena had dreamed her dreams, Audrey felt something she'd been cultivating for 20 years finally settle into permanence. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting, not the peace of simple answers, but the peace that came from doing the work, from holding the complexity, from acknowledging pain while also celebrating resilience, from remembering both the worst of humanity and the best of it. The desert remembered everything, and so did they, and in that remembering, in that refusal to let silence erase truth, in that determination to build meaning from tragedy. That was where healing lived. 24 years later, on July 23, 2048, exactly 48 years after Elena Torres disappeared and 28 years after Tom Garrett's conviction, a new memorial was unveiled in the Arizona State Capitol building. It was a larger initiative, a permanent exhibition about cold cases that had been solved through advances in forensic science and the dedication of investigators who refused to give up. Elena's case was featured prominently. Her photograph, 17, smiling, wearing her jasmine perfume, was displayed alongside her story. But she wasn't alone. Dozens of other victims whose cases had been resolved were honored there, their faces and stories preserved, ensuring they were remembered as people, not just statistics. Audrey, now 74 and walking with a cane but still sharp-minded, attended the ceremony. She was one of the last people still alive who had known Tom Garrett personally, who could speak from direct experience about the particular pain of betrayal by someone trusted. The documentary filmmakers had asked to interview her again, to provide a contemporary reflection decades later. "What I've learned," she told them, sitting in the shade of a mesquite tree outside the Capitol, "is that healing isn't about forgetting. It's not about closure, really. That word suggests a door shutting and ending. But trauma doesn't work like that. Elena's murder shaped entire lives, changed the trajectory of a community, influenced policy and practice for decades. You don't close the door on that. You integrate it. You let it become part of your story without letting it be the only story." "And Tom Garrett?" the interviewer asked. "How do you think about him now, 48 years later?" Audrey was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I think about the complexity, about how evil often looks ordinary, how predators hide behind good deeds and friendly smiles, how our assumptions about what a murderer looks like can be precisely what allows them to operate. I think about the skills he taught me that I still value, and I think about Elena's bones in the desert. Both things are true. He was my mentor and a monster. I don't have to reconcile those facts. I just have to acknowledge them." She looked toward the Capitol building, where Elena's photograph was now permanently displayed. "But mostly I think about Elena, about the life she should have had, the people she should have helped, the grandchildren she should have held. And I think about all the work that's been done in her name, the students educated, the cases solved, the policies changed. That's what I choose to focus on. Not the man who killed her, but the legacy she left behind and the community that refused to let her be forgotten." The interview concluded. Audrey stood slowly, accepting the interviewer's arm for support, and walked into the Capitol building to see the memorial. Young people streamed past her, high school students on a field trip, college students studying criminal justice, families with children learning about justice and persistence and the importance of remembering. And there, among all those faces and stories, was Elena, forever 17, forever dreaming of becoming a doctor, forever beloved. The desert had remembered, and now, so would generations to come. Audrey touched the photograph gently, a goodbye and a promise all at once, and then walked out into the Arizona sunshine, feeling the weight of decades but also the lightness that came from having helped transform tragedy into meaning, darkness into light, silence into a story worth telling. Behind her, the memorial stood permanent and solid, a testament to the truth that evil might win battles but rarely wins the war, that communities can heal even from profound betrayal, and that one life, however brutally stolen, could plant seeds that would bloom for decades, long after everyone involved had turned to dust and memory. The desert remembered everything, and Elena Torres would never be forgotten. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.